The world that Confucius was born into was not a peaceful land of temples and scholars. It was a battlefield, a civilization breaking apart from the inside, a society collapsing under the weight of its own ambition, a world where power ruled and morality had become a weakness. This was China in the 6th century before Christ, a land once united under great kings, now shattered into rival states, a people who once believed in order, now ruled by fear, a culture that once honored virtue, now worshipped strength. History would later call this age the Spring and Autumn period, a beautiful name for an age of blood. The Zhou dynasty still ruled in name, its kings still sat on the throne, but real power was gone. The empire had fractured into dozens of warring kingdoms, each ruled by warlords, hungry for territory, convinced that survival demanded domination. Alliances were temporary, treaties were meaningless, trust was dangerous. Brothers betrayed brothers, sons turned against fathers, ministers poisoned their own kings. Power changed hands through assassination, cities fell through betrayal, kingdoms collapsed overnight. Strength had become law, and when strength becomes law, justice disappears. Villages were burned to send political messages. Fields were destroyed to starve enemies. Civilians were slaughtered to spread fear. The countryside filled with refugees, families carrying everything they owned on their backs, fleeing armies that did not care who lived or died. Children grew up surrounded by violence. Young men were conscripted into endless wars. Old men watched the world they built vanish in smoke, and slowly, something more dangerous than war began to spread. People stopped believing in virtue. They believed only in survival. A man was respected not for his integrity but for his power. A ruler was feared not for his wisdom but for his cruelty. A general was admired not for restraint but for brutality. Society no longer asked, "What is right?" It asked only, "What is strong?" And when a civilization abandons morality, it begins to devour itself. Kings ruled through terror. Ministers ruled through manipulation. Armies ruled through slaughter. The law became whatever the strongest man said it was, and the people learned a brutal lesson. If you want to live, obey. If you want to rise, betray. If you want power, destroy. This was the world Confucius inherited, a civilization with no moral center. Yet beneath the chaos, something ancient still lingered. Old songs still spoke of wise kings. Forgotten texts still whispered of a golden age. Elders still remembered a time when rulers served their people. The memory of civilization had not vanished. It had only been buried. And buried ideas, when rediscovered, can change history. Into this collapsing world, a child would be born, not into wealth, not into power, but into a broken society desperate for order. A boy who would grow up believing something no one else dared to believe, that civilization could be saved. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this video. And also comment your local place and what time is it for you. It's always very satisfying to see from where are you joining us. Confucius was not born into privilege. He was not born into power. He was born into loss. His name was Kong Chu, and from the very beginning, life demanded more of him than it demanded of most. His father had once been a respected warrior and minor noble, a man of strength, discipline, and honor. But by the time Confucius was born, that glory had faded. Age had bent his body. Misfortune had emptied his fortune. And when Confucius was only 3 years old, his father died. The boy would grow up without a father's protection. In a world where power meant survival, this was a dangerous fate. His mother was young, poor, and alone. They lived on the margins of society, outside the circles of influence, far from the courts of kings. While other children trained for war, Confucius learned endurance. While others prepared for power, he prepared for responsibility. From a young age, he worked, he studied, he observed. He learned discipline not from soldiers, but from struggle. He learned humility not from teachers, but from poverty. He learned patience not from philosophy, but from necessity. And in that struggle, something remarkable began to form, a mind that refused to accept chaos as destiny. The boy was different. Even as a child, he was drawn to the past. While others dreamed of becoming generals, Confucius dreamed of becoming wise. He memorized ancient poetry. He studied forgotten rituals. He listened to the stories of old kings and wondered why their world had vanished. He became obsessed with history, not as a collection of dates and battles, but as a record of human behavior. Why did great kingdoms fall? Why did wise rulers disappear? Why did civilization collapse? He did not believe the world was broken by fate. He believed it was broken by people, and that meant it could be repaired. His mother watched as her son transformed into something unusual, a boy who spoke carefully, who listened more than he talked, who treated elders with reverence, who carried himself with dignity beyond his years. Neighbors whispered that he behaved like a noble despite having nothing. But Confucius did not seek status. He sought understanding. He believed the past held the answers to the future, that somewhere in the ruins of history, the blueprint of civilization still existed, and he intended to find it. While warlords sharpened their blades, he sharpened his mind. While armies marched across the land, he walked through ancient texts, and slowly a philosophy began to form, a belief that civilization did not collapse because of enemies. It collapsed because of character. The boy without a father would grow up determined to become a teacher to civilization itself. Confucius knew what it meant to grow up without protection. He knew what it meant to struggle. He knew what it meant to live without power, and that shaped everything he would become. He would never believe that leadership was about domination. He believed it belonged to the good, and that belief would one day change the world. As Confucius grew into a young man, the world around him only grew darker. War followed war. Kingdoms rose and fell. Power shifted like sand beneath the feet of rulers who believed themselves invincible. And everywhere Confucius looked, he saw the same pattern. Ambition without wisdom, authority without virtue, strength without restraint. Society was not merely broken, it was lost. And Confucius believed that a lost civilization could only be saved if it remembered who it once was. So he turned to the past, not as an escape, but as a guide. He searched the ancient records. He studied the rites of forgotten dynasties. He examined the laws of legendary kings, not because he wanted to recreate their world, but because he wanted to understand why their world had worked. He believed history was not a story of fate. It was a record of choices, and every collapse, every golden age, every tragedy carried a lesson. If those lessons could be recovered, civilization could be rebuilt. Confucius became a student of order. He studied how societies function, how families stay strong, how leaders gain loyalty, how laws earn respect. He discovered something simple and terrifying. Every successful civilization rested on the same foundation: moral leadership. When rulers governed with virtue, people followed willingly. When leaders ruled with integrity, order emerged naturally. When authority was just, obedience became trust. But when rulers ruled through fear, society decayed. Violence replaced cooperation. Deception replaced loyalty. Power replaced justice. Confucius saw that law alone could not save a nation. Punishment could control behavior, but it could not build character. Force could create obedience, but not respect. Only virtue could create harmony. He came to believe that the state was not a machine. It was a family. A ruler was not a master. He was a father to the people. And just as a family collapses when the father becomes cruel or absent, a nation collapses when its leaders lose their moral compass. This idea was revolutionary. In an age where kings ruled like gods, Confucius claimed they must rule like men. In a world where power was seized, he said it must be earned. In a society where fear commanded obedience, he believed virtue should inspire loyalty. Confucius did not believe in destiny. He believed in discipline. He believed human nature could be cultivated, that people were not born good or evil. They were shaped by their parents, by their teachers, by their rulers, by their culture, and if culture was corrupt, people would become corrupt. If culture was virtuous, people would become virtuous. So the real battle for civilization was not fought on battlefields. It was fought in the human heart. As Confucius walked the roads of Lu, he watched the world with a philosopher's eyes. He saw how families fell apart when children lost respect for elders. He saw how communities collapsed when neighbors stopped trusting one another. And he understood something most rulers did not, that no army could save a corrupt nation, that no wealth could preserve a civilization without virtue. Only moral order could. By the time Confucius reached adulthood, his path was clear. He would not become a warlord. He would not chase wealth. He would not seek power for its own sake. He would become a teacher, not of weapons, not of politics, but of humanity. He would attempt what no one else dared, to rebuild civilization from the inside out. Confucius did not believe that civilization could be saved by force. He believed it could only be saved by people, not by kings alone, not by generals, not by ministers, but by ordinary men and women learning how to live well. To Confucius, morality was not an abstract theory. It was a daily practice. It governed how you spoke, how you treated your family, how you served your community, how you ruled a nation. He believed that when people became virtuous, society healed naturally. So he began to build a philosophy, not of power, but of humanity. At the center of his thinking stood one idea above all others: in humanness, compassion, moral goodness, the ability to feel for others, to act with kindness, to see every person as fully human. Ren was not weakness, it was strength, because a society without compassion becomes cruel. A nation without empathy becomes violent, and a world without humanity becomes unlivable. Confucius believed that every moral decision began with one question: what kind of person are you becoming? But compassion alone was not enough. Good intentions could still lead to chaos. So Confucius taught Li proper conduct, ritual, respect, not empty ceremony, but behavior that creates harmony. The way you greet your elders, the way you speak to your parents, the way you treat strangers, the way you conduct business, the way you rule. Li transformed morality into habit. It made virtue visible, because when people behave with dignity, trust grows. When trust grows, order follows. And when order follows, civilization survives. Then there was Yi, righteousness, the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult, even when it is costly, even when no one is watching. Yi was the backbone of moral character. It was what separated honorable men from opportunists, principled leaders from tyrants, civilization builders from destroyers. Confucius believed that without righteousness, laws become tools of oppression and power becomes a weapon. And finally, there was Shao, filial pietu, respect for parents, honor for ancestors, reverence for elders. Confucius believed that family was the foundation of society. A nation that forgets its parents forgets its past. A people that abandons its elders abandons its wisdom. When families collapse, society collapses. So he taught that a good citizen begins as a good child. One who honors their parents learns respect. One who respects elders learns humility. One who practices humility learns wisdom, and wisdom builds civilization. Together, these principles formed a moral architecture. Ren gave people compassion. Eli gave them discipline. Yi gave them courage. Shao gave them roots. It was not a religion. It was not a law code. It was a way of life. Confucius did not promise heaven. He promised harmony. He did not speak of gods. He spoke of people. He did not ask for worship. He asked for effort. He believed that a single good person could influence a family. A single good family could shape a community. A single good community could transform a nation. And a nation of virtuous people could change the world. This was his revolution, not of armies, but of character, not of power, but of principle, not of domination, but of dignity. And the man who had grown up without a father would become a teacher to civilization itself. Confucius did not build a palace. He built a school. And in a world ruled by kings and warlords, that was the most radical act of all. Education in ancient China belonged to the elite. Only nobles could afford tutors. Only aristocrats studied history. Only the powerful learned the rights of leadership. The poor were taught obedience. The rich were taught command. Confucius shattered that order. He opened his teachings to anyone who wished to learn. Farmers, orphans, former soldiers, merchants, servants, all were welcome, not because they were important, but because they were human. He believed wisdom was not inherited. It was cultivated, and anyone willing to discipline their character deserved the chance to become wise. His classroom had no walls, no throne, no pulpit, no title. He taught while walking the roads, while eating with students, while resting beneath trees, while traveling between villages. And he never lectured. He questioned. He challenged. He forced reflection. He believed real learning happens when a student changes, not when they memorize. He did not teach people what to think. He taught them how to live. His students were drawn not just to his ideas, but to his character. Here was a man who lived exactly as he taught. He dressed simply. He lived modestly. He spoke carefully. He treated every person with dignity. In an age of arrogance, he practiced humility. In an age of cruelty, he practiced compassion. In an age of ambition, he practiced restraint. And people noticed. His reputation spread. A strange teacher, a moral philosopher, a man who spoke of ancient kings and forgotten virtues. Some laughed at him, some dismissed him as idealistic, but others listened, and those who listened changed. Young men who had grown up dreaming of power began dreaming of virtue. Students who once admired generals began admiring sages. Future officials who might have ruled through fear learned to govern through example. Confucius was not building an army. He was building a generation, a generation that believed leadership was a moral responsibility, that authority came from character, that true power was self-control. And slowly, quietly, his influence spread. What made Confucius dangerous to the established order was not rebellion, it was transformation. He was not telling people to overthrow their rulers. He was teaching them to become better than their rulers. He was not calling for revolution. He was building conscience, and conscience is more powerful than any sword. Confucius believed that civilization could only survive if its people were educated, not just in reading and writing, but in right and wrong, not just in law and ritual, but in compassion and restraint. A society that trains soldiers, but not citizens, will collapse. A nation that raises warriors, but not moral leaders, will destroy itself. And Confucius was determined to stop that fate. From village to village, from state to state, he carried his vision. A vision of a world where rulers ruled by example, where families were strong, where society was held together by trust. A vision of a civilization reborn. Confucius did not believe that teaching alone was enough. He believed the world could not be saved if those in power refused to change. A teacher could shape students, but only a ruler could shape a nation. And so Confucius began to dream of something dangerous. He dreamed of reform. He dreamed of entering government, of advising kings, of reshaping the state from within, not to gain power, but to give it purpose. Confucius believed that a ruler should be the most virtuous man in the kingdom. That leadership was not about domination, but about example. A true king, he taught, does not need cruelty. His character becomes law. A just ruler does not rule through fear. He rules through trust. A wise king does not demand obedience. He inspires loyalty. To Confucius, government was not a tool of control. It was a moral responsibility. And when that responsibility is betrayed, society pays the price. But the courts of kings were not built for philosophers. They were built for warriors, strategists, and manipulators. Power was maintained through force. Influence was bought with gold. Truth was sacrificed for advantage. Confucius knew the danger. He knew that entering politics meant entering a world that rewarded deception and punished honesty. Yet he believed that virtue must be tested in reality, that philosophy must walk into the fire, that ideas must confront power. He believed that even the most corrupt court could be changed by a single moral voice, that even the most ruthless ruler might listen to reason, that even the most broken kingdom could be restored. It was an idealistic dream, and in a world ruled by ambition, idealism is dangerous. Confucius began seeking office. He traveled between states, offering his counsel. He spoke of moral leadership, of just governance, of the ancient kings who ruled through virtue. Some laughed, some dismissed him as naive. Others listened carefully, because ideas can be dangerous. A ruler who governs through virtue leaves no room for corruption. A minister who values righteousness cannot be bribed. A court guided by moral law cannot be manipulated. And there were many who did not want change. Yet Confucius persisted. He believed that civilization was worth the risk, that if even one kingdom embraced virtue, the others would follow, that moral leadership could spread like fire. And for a moment, it seemed possible. Rumors of a philosopher teacher reached the rulers of Lu, a man of discipline, a man of integrity, a man who commanded loyalty without fear. The court took notice, and Confucius was called. The dream was becoming real. The teacher was stepping into power, and the world was about to test whether virtue could survive inside a palace. The court of Lu was not a place for dreamers. It was a world of intrigue, ambition, and quiet betrayal. Behind its polished halls and ritual ceremonies lay a ruthless political machine. Ministers competed for influence, noble families guarded their privileges, advisors whispered in the ears of rulers, and every decision was shaped by power. Into this world walked Confucius, a teacher, a moral philosopher, a man who spoke of virtue in a palace built on manipulation. At first, he was treated as a curiosity, a scholar with strange ideas, a relic of forgotten traditions, a man who believed kings could be moral. But Confucius was not naive. He understood the language of power, and he knew that if reform was to succeed, it had to begin at the top. Confucius did not flatter. He did not bargain. He did not compromise his principles. When he spoke to ministers, he spoke of duty. When he addressed nobles, he spoke of responsibility. When he advised rulers, he spoke of justice. He reminded them that authority without virtue leads to collapse. That fear may control people, but it cannot unite them. That power built on cruelty always turns inward. His words unsettled the court. Some dismissed him, some mocked him, but others listened. Because the state of Lu was weakening, corruption was spreading, order was slipping, public trust was eroding, and the rulers could feel it. They needed stability. They needed legitimacy. They needed something more than force. They needed moral authority. Confucius offered them a path, a return to ancient principles, a government built on example, a court ruled by discipline. Slowly, doors opened, invitations arrived, councils requested his presence, and Confucius stepped deeper into the machinery of power. For the first time in his life, his ideas were no longer just words. They were becoming policy. He began advising officials, drafting reforms, reshaping court behavior. He insisted on proper conduct, on respect for law, on discipline among ministers. And something remarkable happened. Crime declined, corruption slowed, public order improved. The people noticed. For the first time in years, the state of Lu began to feel like a civilization again. Confucius was no longer just a teacher. He was becoming a statesman, and that made him dangerous because moral men threaten corrupt systems. A government built on manipulation cannot survive integrity, and those who had grown rich on corruption saw in Confucius an enemy. They whispered against him, plotted quietly, waited patiently, because in politics, reformers rarely survive. Confucius knew the danger. He knew power attracts enemies. He knew virtue exposes corruption. Yet he believed that retreat was not an option. If civilization was to be saved, someone had to walk into the fire, and he was willing. The philosopher had entered the palace. The teacher had stepped into power, and history was about to test whether morality could survive inside the throne room. Power is a dangerous place for idealists, and the closer Confucius moved to the heart of government, the clearer that danger became. The Palace of Lu was not a school. It was a battlefield, not of swords, but of ambition, not of armies, but of influence. Every noble family guarded its privileges. Every minister protected his position. Every advisor plotted for advantage. Confucius had walked into a world that thrived on manipulation, and he had brought with him something far more dangerous than rebellion. He had brought integrity. At first, his reforms were welcomed. Order returned. Discipline improved. Public trust grew. The people admired him. Students followed him. Young officials respected him. And for a brief moment, it seemed that virtue might triumph. But power does not surrender quietly. The old elite felt threatened. Their profits depended on corruption. Their influence depended on disorder. Their authority depended on fear. Confucius was dismantling their world, and they would not forgive him. Whispers spread through the court. They called him naive. They called him dangerous. They called him unrealistic. They said his ideas weakened the state. That moral governance made rulers vulnerable. That virtue had no place in politics. They accused him of undermining tradition, of challenging noble authority, of corrupting young officials with dangerous ideals. The philosopher who spoke of humanity was being painted as an enemy of order. Confucius felt the walls closing in. Every reform created resistance. Every success created enemies. Every step forward provoked backlash. Yet he refused to compromise. He would not soften his principles. He would not dilute his message. He would not trade virtue for safety. He believed that a ruler who abandons morality abandons civilization itself, and he would not be silent. The court grew colder. Invitations stopped. Councils closed their doors. Allies disappeared. The same men who had praised him now avoided him. The same officials who had followed his guidance now feared association. Power had turned against him. Confucius stood alone, a teacher in a palace of warriors, a moralist in a court of schemers, a philosopher surrounded by ambition. And he understood something tragic, that the world was not ready, that kings did not want wisdom. They wanted obedience, that ministers did not want virtue. They wanted control, that power did not want reform. It wanted survival. The dream of saving civilization from within was slipping away, and Confucius could feel it. The palace that had once opened its doors was preparing to cast him out. The throne that had once listened was turning its back. The teacher who believed he could change the world was about to learn the price of idealism. In the next episode, we will hear about Confucius rises to power. Confucius becomes a minister. Confucius attempts to rule by virtue. And Confucius is betrayed. When Confucius was forced to step away from the palace, he did not retreat into silence. He returned to the people, because long before he believed kings could be saved, he believed civilization could be rebuilt from the ground up, not through power, but through education. In a world where knowledge belonged only to nobles, Confucius did something revolutionary. He opened his teachings to everyone, not only to the sons of ministers, not only to heirs of noble families, but to farmers, laborers, soldiers, and orphans. Anyone who was willing to learn, anyone who was willing to discipline their character, anyone who was willing to walk the difficult path of virtue. Education had always been a privilege. Confucius turned it into a right. His school had no walls, no gates, no towers, no guards. It existed wherever he walked, along dusty roads, beneath ancient trees, inside humble homes, at the edge of rice fields. Students gathered around him, not because he commanded them, but because he inspired them. He did not promise wealth. He did not promise power. He did not promise success. He promised wisdom, and wisdom, in a world collapsing under corruption, was priceless. Confucius did not teach like other scholars. He did not lecture. He did not dictate. He did not demand memorization. He asked questions. He challenged assumptions. He forced students to confront themselves. He believed knowledge that does not change behavior is useless. A man who knows what is right but does not act on it has learned nothing. So Confucius taught discipline. He taught humility. He taught responsibility. He taught that character is built through daily practice, not grand gestures, not heroic moments, but small choices made every day. His students followed him across states. They slept in barns. They ate simple food. They walked for weeks along dangerous roads. They endured hunger, cold, ridicule, but they stayed because they had never met a man like him, a man who lived exactly as he taught, who refused luxury, who rejected bribes, who treated servants and nobles with the same respect. In a world obsessed with status, Confucius saw only character. Slowly, his reputation grew. People whispered of a strange teacher, a man who spoke of ancient kings and forgotten virtues, a philosopher who believed rulers should be moral, a scholar who claimed civilization could be saved. Some laughed, some dismissed him, but others listened, and those who listened changed. Confucius was not building an army. He was building a generation that believed leadership was service, that power was responsibility, that authority came from virtue. He was planting seeds that would take centuries to grow, seeds of discipline, seeds of respect, seeds of moral order. And one day, those seeds would become civilization itself. The palace had rejected him, but the people had accepted him, and that would prove far more powerful. Confucius never called them disciples. He called them companions, because he did not believe wisdom could be imposed. It had to be discovered, and the men who gathered around him were not ordinary students. They were seekers, young men born into a collapsing world, raised in an age of war and betrayal, surrounded by ambition and cruelty. They had grown up watching kingdoms burn. They had seen fathers die in battle, mothers beg for food, villages vanish under marching armies, and they had come to believe that something was broken in the world. They did not know how to fix it, but they believed Confucius might. They followed him across states, through mountain passes and river valleys, through war zones and famine lands, through cities ruled by tyrants and villages ruled by fear. They slept in barns. They ate whatever food they could find. They walked for weeks along dangerous roads. They endured hunger, cold, ridicule. People mocked them. A group of wandering idealists, following a poor teacher with strange ideas, believing morality could defeat power, but they stayed because they had never met a man like Confucius. He did not command them. He inspired them. He did not promise success. He promised meaning. He did not offer protection. He offered truth. And for young men searching for purpose, that was enough. Confucius treated them not as followers, but as future leaders. He challenged them relentlessly. He tested their discipline, their patience, their character. When they complained of hunger, he spoke of endurance. When they feared danger, he spoke of courage. When they doubted their mission, he spoke of responsibility. He reminded them that a man who cannot govern himself cannot govern others, that a leader who seeks comfort will betray his people, that a ruler who loves power will destroy everything he touches. Some of his students were sons of nobles. Others were born poor. Some were former soldiers. Others were merchants. But under Confucius, status disappeared. Only character mattered. A man was judged not by his family name, but by his conduct, not by his wealth, but by his integrity, not by his ambition, but by his restraint. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, Confucius created equality, not political equality, moral equality. Every student stood on the same ground. Every man was responsible for his own virtue. Among them were men who would one day become ministers, generals, and advisors, men who would carry Confucius's teachings into the courts of kings, men who would shape the future of China. But at the time, they were just travelers, walking beside an aging teacher, listening to stories of ancient kings, learning how civilization once worked and how it might be rebuilt. Confucius believed that a single good man could influence a family. A single good family could shape a village. A single good village could transform a state, and a state of virtuous men could change history. So he invested everything in his students, because he knew his life would end, but his ideas would not. They followed him not because he was powerful, but because he was right, and in a world ruled by fear that made him dangerous. Confucius did not believe leadership was a position, he believed it was a burden. A ruler, in his view, was not a master over the people. He was their guardian. A king was not meant to dominate. He was meant to serve. This belief stood in direct opposition to the world Confucius lived in, a world where thrones were seized through bloodshed, where crowns were protected by armies, where obedience was enforced through fear. Confucius rejected that vision of power. He taught that authority came not from weapons, but from virtue. He told his students that a true leader rules by example. If a ruler is just, the people will become just. If a ruler is disciplined, the people will become disciplined. If a ruler is compassionate, the people will become compassionate. Law alone could not build a civilization. Punishment could control behavior, but it could not build loyalty. Fear could enforce obedience, but it could not create trust. Only moral authority could unite a people. Confucius believed that a ruler's character was more important than his laws. A corrupt ruler would turn even good laws into tools of oppression. A virtuous ruler would turn imperfect laws into instruments of justice. So he taught that before a man could govern others, he must first govern himself. A man who cannot control his desires cannot control a nation. A man who seeks power for its own sake will destroy everything he touches. A man who rules without restraint will become a tyrant. To Confucius, leadership began in the home. A man who disrespects his parents will not respect his people. A man who abuses his family will abuse his power. A man who cannot show compassion to those closest to him will never show it to strangers. The family, he taught, was the first school of leadership, and the state was simply a larger family. Confucius warned his students about ambition. He told them that ambition without virtue is poison. It blinds men, corrupts judgment, destroys conscience. A man driven by ambition will sacrifice justice for success. A ruler driven by ambition will sacrifice his people for power. He believed the most dangerous leaders were not the cruel ones. They were the clever ones. Men who spoke of loyalty while plotting betrayal. Men who preached order while sowing chaos. Men who wore the mask of virtue while serving only themselves. Confucius trained his students to recognize such men, to resist them, to never become them. He taught that the greatest victory was not conquering enemies, it was conquering oneself. That the greatest achievement was not ruling a kingdom, it was ruling one's own desires. That the strongest man was not the one with the largest army, it was the one with the strongest character. In a world obsessed with domination, Confucius offered restraint. In an age of conquest, he taught humility. In a society addicted to power, he preached responsibility. And slowly, quietly, his vision of leadership spread, not through decrees, not through armies, but through men who believed civilization deserved better. Confucius did not write laws, he wrote character. He did not build institutions, he built conscience, because he believed that no civilization can survive if its people do not know how to live together. Armies can protect borders, walls can defend cities, but only morality can hold a society together. So Confucius created a code, not carved in stone, but carved into the human soul. At the heart of his vision stood a simple truth: that civilization is not built by kings, it is built by families. A nation is only as strong as its homes. A society is only as stable as its marriages. A people are only as moral as their children. When families collapse, states collapse. When children lose respect for parents, nations lose respect for law. So Confucius taught that the family is the foundation of civilization. He taught that a child who honors his parents learns gratitude. A child who respects elders learns humility. A child who practices discipline learns self-control. And a child who learns self-control becomes a citizen who respects order. This was not sentiment, it was strategy. Confucius believed moral behavior must be trained. Just like soldiers are trained for war, citizens must be trained for virtue. He believed that ritual was not empty tradition. It was social glue, the way people greet each other, the way they speak, the way they eat, the way they mourn, the way they celebrate. These daily acts taught respect. They created dignity. They turned chaos into harmony. A society without ritual becomes crude. A people without manners become violent. A nation without discipline becomes ungovernable. Confucius taught that righteousness must guide every decision, that profit must never come before justice, that success must never replace integrity, that power must never outrank virtue. A man who sacrifices righteousness for advantage destroys his soul. A ruler who sacrifices justice for power destroys his nation. He taught that compassion must govern human relationships, that cruelty poisons society, that indifference erodes trust, that kindness builds loyalty. A society without empathy becomes brutal. A nation without mercy becomes tyrannical. A people without humanity become dangerous. Together, these values formed a moral architecture, not enforced by police, not imposed by force, but lived, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from leader to citizen. Confucius believed that when morality becomes habit, law becomes unnecessary, that when people do what is right by nature, punishment becomes irrelevant. This was his dream. A civilization governed by conscience, a society ruled by virtue, a nation held together by trust. It was not a fantasy, it was a plan, and Confucius intended to put it into action. Confucius never intended to become immortal. He never planned to build a legacy. He never imagined that his words would travel across centuries. He believed wisdom belonged in conversation, not in books, because he believed truth lived in dialogue, in questions, in reflection, in shared understanding. But the men who walked beside him understood something he did not, that his voice would one day fall silent, and if it did, the world might forget. As Confucius aged, his students began to write, not formal treatises, not philosophical systems, but memories, conversations by campfires, lessons taught on dusty roads, debates beneath ancient trees, moments of quiet reflection after long days of travel. They recorded his questions, his stories, his principles, his warnings. They captured his voice, and slowly they would call it the Analects, a simple collection of sayings, short sentences, direct wisdom, unadorned truth, not poetry, not theory, but guidance, a manual for life. The Analects did not speak of gods. It spoke of people. It did not promise heaven. It promised harmony. It did not teach how to conquer. It taught how to live. It spoke of duty, of discipline, of respect, of humility, of righteousness. It taught that a gentleman is not born, he is made. That character is built through effort. That virtue requires practice. That wisdom demands patience. Confucius did not want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. He did not claim to possess truth. He claimed to seek it. Again and again, he reminded his students, I transmit, I do not create. He believed he was restoring ancient wisdom, not inventing something new, and yet what his students preserved would become the foundation of an entire civilization. The Analects spread quietly, copied by hand, passed from teacher to student, shared among scholars. It traveled from village to village, from court to court, from generation to generation. Long before emperors adopted his philosophy, ordinary people were already living by it. Families shaped their children by his teachings. Teachers built schools around his words. Officials quoted his wisdom. His voice had escaped time. Confucius would never see the full impact of what his students had done. He would never know that his words would guide kings, that his principles would shape laws, that his philosophy would govern empires. He believed his mission was unfinished, but history had already begun to prove him wrong. The Analects became more than a book. It became a compass, a moral map for a civilization searching for order, a guide for leaders who wanted to rule justly, a mirror for men who wanted to live honorably. Confucius had planted seeds. His students had preserved them, and long after the teacher was gone, those seeds would grow into an empire of ideas. For most of his life, Confucius had spoken from the margins, a wandering teacher, a moral philosopher, a voice outside the palace walls. But ideas, when powerful enough, do not stay ignored forever. Slowly, his reputation began to reach the ears of rulers, not as a dreamer, not as a poot, but as a man who could restore order. The state of Lu was weakening. Corruption was spreading through its court. Noble families fought for influence. Ministers enriched themselves at the expense of the people. Crime was rising. Public trust was collapsing. The rulers could feel it. A kingdom cannot survive without legitimacy, and legitimacy cannot exist without justice. So they turned to the man who spoke of virtue. Confucius was summoned, not as a teacher, but as an advisor. For the first time, the philosopher stepped into the machinery of power. The palace that once mocked him now listened. The court that once dismissed him now watched carefully. Because desperation makes kings seek wisdom, Confucius did not change his tone. He did not soften his principles. He spoke to rulers the same way he spoke to farmers, with honesty, with discipline, with moral clarity. He told them that corruption destroys states from the inside, that cruelty breeds rebellion, that injustice invites collapse. He warned them that fear can control people, but it cannot unite them. Only virtue can do that. To the surprise of many, the rulers listened. They appointed Confucius to government service, and suddenly the teacher held authority, not through force, but through trust. For the first time in decades, Lu began to change. Officials were held accountable. Court discipline was enforced. Laws were respected. Crime fell. Public confidence returned. The people noticed. For the first time in years, the state felt like a civilization again. Confucius had done what no general could. He had restored order without bloodshed. But power attracts enemies, and moral men threaten corrupt systems. The more Confucius succeeded, the more dangerous he became. Confucius was appointed Minister of Justice. It was the highest office he would ever hold, and it was the greatest test of his philosophy. For the first time, his ideas were no longer words. They were law. He ruled without cruelty. He governed without fear. He enforced justice with restraint. Corrupt officials were removed. Criminal networks were dismantled. Power was stripped from abusive nobles. Order returned, and the people celebrated him. They called him the righteous minister, the moral guardian, the man who made law humane. But politics is not built for righteousness. It is built for survival. The noble families had grown rich from corruption. The ministers had grown powerful through manipulation. Confucius was dismantling their empire, and they would not forgive him. They whispered against him. They accused him of undermining tradition, of weakening the state, of threatening noble authority. They claimed his reforms made Lu vulnerable, that moral leadership invited conquest, that virtue was weakness, and they waited, because in politics, time is the sharpest weapon. Confucius could feel the danger, but he would not retreat. He believed that justice was worth the risk, that civilization was worth the fight, and he stood his ground. The court turned against him. One by one, his allies disappeared. Councils closed their doors. Invitations stopped. Support faded. The same men who had praised him now feared him, because corruption survives only in silence. And Confucius refused to be silent. The nobles plotted. They bribed ministers. They manipulated the ruler. They spread lies. They painted Confucius as a dangerous idealist, a man whose ideas would destroy the state. They warned that moral governance would weaken Lu against its enemies, that virtue invited invasion, that discipline would collapse the economy. Fear replaced reason, and fear always wins in palaces. The ruler began to doubt. The philosopher who once inspired hope now stood alone. Power had turned against him. Confucius understood the truth, that the palace did not want wisdom, it wanted control, that kings did not want virtue, they wanted obedience, and that the world was not ready for moral government. The fall was quiet. No trial, no execution, no public disgrace, just silence. Confucius was dismissed, stripped of office, removed from court, exiled from power. The palace that had once welcomed him closed its gates. The throne that had once listened turned away. The dream was over. The teacher who believed he could save civilization from within had been defeated by ambition. He left Lu not in chains, but in disappointment, an old man walking away from the throne, carrying nothing but his principles. He would never again hold office. He would never again command authority. The world of power had rejected him, but the world of people had not. In the next episode, Confucius wanders in exile. Confucius faces hunger and humiliation. Confucius watches kingdoms collapse, and Confucius confronts the possibility that his life's work has failed. Confucius left Lu as a defeated man, not defeated in spirit, not defeated in conviction, but defeated by the world of power. The palace had closed its gates. The throne had turned away. The court had silenced him, and so the philosopher became a wanderer. Once again, he returned to the roads. But now, he was no longer a hopeful reformer. He was an aging idealist walking through a violent world. China was still burning. States rose and fell like waves. Armies marched endlessly across the land. Villages vanished beneath conquest. And everywhere Confucius went, he saw the same story. Rulers ruled through fear. Ministers ruled through corruption. Generals ruled through slaughter. The kingdoms he visited were not seeking wisdom. They were seeking victory. They did not ask how to build peace. They asked how to conquer. They did not want virtue. They wanted dominance. Confucius traveled with his students, a small group of men carrying no weapons, no banners, no wealth, no protection, only ideas. They walked through territories ruled by tyrants, through regions devastated by war, through lands where soldiers controlled everything. They slept in barns. They begged for food. They endured hunger and cold. And yet, they continued because Confucius refused to surrender. He still believed that civilization could be saved, that kings could be taught, that power could be restrained, that virtue could prevail. So he continued to seek rulers, state after state, court after court, offering the same message: rule with justice, lead with virtue, govern with humanity. Some rulers invited him out of curiosity, out of desperation, out of political calculation. They listened, and then they laughed. They said his ideas were noble, but useless, that compassion had no place in war, that morality had no place in politics, that virtue could not defend borders. They told him the world was ruled by power, not principles. Confucius watched as these same rulers later fell, betrayed by ministers, overthrown by generals, conquered by rivals. Their kingdoms collapsed one by one, and each fall confirmed his warnings that power without virtue destroys itself. The road was cruel. There were days without food, nights without shelter, moments of danger. At one point, enemies tried to assassinate him. At another, he was surrounded by hostile soldiers. Once, his group was trapped between rival armies, and yet Confucius never turned back. His students asked him why he continued, why he endured humiliation, why he accepted hunger, why he risked death, and Confucius answered simply, because civilization is worth saving. The philosopher walked through a collapsing world, not with a sword, but with conscience. Every kingdom Confucius entered carried the same scent: smoke, steel, fear. Walls were higher, armies were larger, executions were public, power ruled openly. Confucius walked into courts built on violence and spoke of compassion. He stood before thrones soaked in blood and spoke of restraint. He looked kings in the eyes and told them they were destroying their own world. Some rulers invited him as entertainment. A philosopher from Lu, a strange old man with moral theories. They asked him to speak. They listened, and then they smiled, because to them his ideas were beautiful and useless. They told him the same thing again and again, that morality does not win wars, that compassion does not protect borders, that virtue does not stop rebellions. They told him that the world belongs to the strong, not the just. Confucius answered calmly that strength without justice becomes cruelty, that power without virtue becomes tyranny, that victory without morality becomes destruction. He warned them that fear builds enemies, that oppression breeds rebellion, that corruption invites collapse. They nodded, and then they returned to their generals. Confucius watched rulers execute rivals, imprison advisors, betray allies. He watched kings destroy their own people in the name of security. And everywhere he went, he saw the same ending: kingdoms tearing themselves apart. One ruler mocked him openly. He said, "Your ideas are for peaceful times. This is an age of war." Confucius replied, "Then this is exactly when they are needed." Another ruler told him, "A kingdom ruled by virtue will be conquered." Confucius answered, "A kingdom ruled by cruelty will collapse from within." But kings do not listen to philosophers. They listen to generals. They listen to spies. They listen to men who promise victory. Confucius left each court with the same sadness. He had seen what was coming. He had seen their fate, and he could do nothing to stop it. Some of his students lost hope. They asked if civilization could truly be saved, if kings would ever change, if morality had any place in the real world. Confucius answered, "A gentleman does not abandon virtue because others abandon it." He believed that the measure of a man is not whether he succeeds, but whether he remains righteous. The road grew harder, food grew scarce, enemies grew bolder, and yet Confucius continued because he believed that if even one ruler listened, history could change. But the world was not ready, and the philosopher was walking into legend. The road does not reward idealists. It tests them. It breaks the weak. It humbles the proud. It exposes the limits of hope. And for Confucius, the road became merciless. He had left the comfort of Lu behind. Now there were no palaces, no courts, no protection, only endless miles of dust and danger. There were days when they had no food. They begged in villages ruined by war. They searched abandoned farms. They survived on roots and grain scraps. Once, they went 7 days without a full meal. His students collapsed from exhaustion. Confucius, already an old man, kept walking. There were nights without shelter. They slept beneath broken walls, in burned temples, in empty stables. Cold winds cut through their thin cloaks. Rain soaked their bedding, and still they rose before dawn and continued. The world they walked through was cruel. Soldiers ruled the roads. Bandits hunted travelers. Villages feared strangers. More than once, they were chased away with stones. Once, a local governor accused them of being spies. They were imprisoned, stripped of their belongings, threatened with execution. Only luck saved them. At one point, rival armies closed in from both sides. They were trapped. No food, no escape, no protection. For days, they waited, expecting death. Confucius remained calm. He taught his students poetry to steady their minds. He spoke of ancient kings who endured worse. He reminded them that fear is a prison. His students asked him why the heavens allowed such suffering, why a man devoted to virtue must live like a criminal, why justice seemed powerless. Confucius answered, "Heaven does not promise comfort. It tests character." The humiliation was constant. Kings dismissed him. Officials mocked him. Scholars ridiculed him. They called him a dreamer, a relic of a forgotten age, a fool who believed morality could defeat war. And yet, he did not bend. He did not grow bitter. He did not abandon his principles. Even in hunger, he practiced discipline. Even in fear, he taught courage. Even in despair, he preached hope. His students watched him carefully. They saw a man who lived exactly as he taught, who refused to steal even when starving, who refused to lie even when threatened, who refused to hate even when betrayed. In a world of brutality, Confucius remained humane, and slowly his legend grew, not in palaces, but on roads, among farmers, among soldiers, among villagers. People whispered of a wandering sage, a man who endured suffering without bitterness, a teacher who carried civilization on his back. The philosopher walked through fire, and history walked with him. Confucius did not travel alone. He walked with men who would one day shape an empire. They were not kings. They were not generals. They were not nobles. They were students. Young men who had chosen wisdom over comfort, virtue over ambition, meaning over power, and history would remember them. There was Yan Hui, the poorest among them, a man who owned almost nothing and complained about nothing. He slept on straw, ate simple grain, wore patched clothing, yet he was always smiling. Confucius called him his greatest student because Yan Hui learned not only with his mind, but with his soul. He lived the teachings. He did not seek office. He did not seek wealth. He sought virtue, and in Confucius's eyes, that made him rich. There was Xilu, a former warrior, loud, impulsive, fearless. He carried a sword long after others laid theirs down. He believed in action more than reflection. Confucius taught him restraint. That courage without wisdom is recklessness. That loyalty without judgment becomes blind obedience. Xilu would one day die defending his principles. A warrior shaped by philosophy. There was Zigong, a merchant, brilliant, ambitious, silver-tongued. He could negotiate with kings, outwit rivals, manipulate markets. Confucius taught him integrity, that success without virtue is empty, that profit without justice poisons society. Zigong would later become a diplomat, carrying Confucian ideals into foreign courts. These men were different backgrounds, different talents, different temperaments, but they shared one thing. They believed in the dream, that civilization could be saved, that virtue could rule, that power could be restrained. Confucius trained them not to serve him, but to surpass him. He told them, "A teacher opens the door, you must walk through it." He did not want followers. He wanted leaders, men who could carry his ideas into the future, men who could walk into courts and speak truth, men who could stand against tyranny. They would one day become ministers, advisors, governors. They would influence kings. They would write history. They would spread Confucian philosophy across China. But now they were travelers, walking dusty roads beside an old teacher, learning how to build a civilization. Confucius knew his time was limited. He was growing old. His strength was fading. But his students were young, and they would carry his vision long after he was gone. Empires fall, dynasties collapse, but ideas survive, and Confucius was building an empire of minds. As the years passed, the road carved its mark upon Confucius. His hair turned white, his steps slowed, his voice softened, but his resolve did not fade. He had walked through famine, through war, through betrayal. He had stood before kings and spoken truth. He had endured hunger without bitterness. He had faced humiliation without hatred. And still, the world remained broken. The states were still at war. The people still suffered. The rulers still ruled through fear. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, Confucius wondered if heaven had abandoned him. He believed in heaven, not as a god with a face, but as a moral order, a force that shaped destiny, a will that guided history, a law greater than kings. He believed heaven had given him his mission, to restore civilization, to awaken rulers, to teach humanity, and yet heaven had not rewarded him. It had tested him once after hearing of the death of Yan Hui, his beloved student. Confucius broke. He wept openly. "My heaven has abandoned me," he said. The death of Yan Hui was more than personal loss. It felt like a sign that virtue did not protect the good, that righteousness did not guarantee survival, that the world did not reward moral men. And for a moment, even Confucius felt doubt. His students watched him carefully. They had never seen him despair. They had never seen him question his mission. And now they saw their teacher face something greater than kings. He was facing heaven itself. Confucius asked the question he had avoided his entire life. Had his work been in vain? Had his teachings changed anything? Had civilization moved even an inch? But then he remembered the faces, the farmers who had listened, the children who had learned, the students who had followed him across kingdoms. He remembered Yan Hui's quiet devotion, Zilu's fearless loyalty, Zigong's morale ambition. He remembered the villages where his words had taken root, and he understood something. Civilizations do not change in a lifetime. They change across generations. Confucius did not need to see victory. He only needed to plant seeds, and seeds take time. So he rose again. He wiped his tears, and he continued, not because he believed success was guaranteed, but because virtue is not measured by outcomes. It is measured by integrity. He told his students, "A gentleman is ashamed if his words exceed his deeds." He would not become a man of despair. He would remain a man of action. Confucius had faced kings. He had faced hunger. He had faced death. Now he faced heaven, and he chose faith. After 14 years on the road, Confucius returned to Lu. He did not return as a minister. He did not return as a reformer. He did not return as a man of power. He returned as a legend, the teacher who had challenged kings, the philosopher who had endured exile, the wanderer who had carried civilization across war-torn lands. He walked back into the state that had once cast him out, an old man now, his beard white, his back bent, his steps slow, but his spirit remained unbroken. Lu had changed. The court was weaker, the nobles more corrupt, the people more weary. The same decay he had warned about had taken root. The rulers who once ignored him now remembered his words. The ministers who once mocked him now quoted his teachings, because when civilizations begin to fail, they search for wisdom. Confucius no longer sought office. He no longer believed palaces could be saved. He had seen too much ambition, too much betrayal, too much blood. Now he turned his full attention to the future. Not through kings, but through memory, he returned to teaching, not as a wandering sage, but as the elder of Chinese civilization. Students traveled from distant states to hear him speak. Young scholars knelt before him. Officials sought his counsel. Poets recorded his words. For the first time in his life, the world finally listened. Confucius taught history. He preserved ancient texts. He edited the Book of Songs. He restored the rituals of the Zhou kings. He believed a civilization that forgets its past cannot survive its future. So he became a bridge between ancient wisdom and a broken world. But age carries its own sorrow. One by one, his closest students died. Yan Hui, his greatest disciple, Xilu, the fearless warrior, others who had walked beside him on the long road. Each loss carved deeper into his heart. He had given his life to building a future. Now he was watching it slip beyond his reach. Confucius once said, "At 70, I follow the desires of my heart without transgressing what is right." He had reached that age. He had done all he could. Now he prepared for the end. He spent his final years teaching quietly, walking slowly, speaking gently, watching his students carry his work forward. He knew he would never see the world he dreamed of, but he knew it would come, because ideas outlive men. Confucius had failed as a politician, but he had succeeded as a teacher, and teachers shape civilizations. The wandering philosopher had come home, and history had begun to catch up with him. Confucius had finally come home, not as a minister, not as a reformer, not as a man of power, but as the elder of a civilization. The wandering years were over. The roads were behind him. The palaces no longer mattered. Now only the future remained. He lived quietly in Lu, teaching, writing, preserving the past. Students filled his home. Some came from distant states. Some walked for weeks to reach him. Some left families and fortunes behind. They came not for wealth, not for status, not for power. They came for wisdom. Confucius no longer spoke of saving kings. He spoke of saving memory. He believed that a civilization that forgets its past has no future, so he turned his final years to preservation. He edited the ancient texts, collected the Book of Songs, restored the rituals of the Zhou dynasty. He rebuilt China's moral foundation, one scroll at a time. But age is merciless. His body weakened, his steps slowed, his voice softened, and death began to take those closest to him. Yan Hui, his greatest student, Xilu, his fearless companion, others who had walked beside him for decades. Each loss carved deeper into his heart. He once said, "Heaven has forsaken me, not in anger, but in sorrow." The man who had given his life to teaching others now faced loneliness. The classroom grew quieter, the laughter faded, the roads that once echoed with debate fell silent. Yet, even in grief, Confucius did not abandon his mission. He taught until his voice failed. He corrected manuscripts until his hands shook. He debated students until exhaustion overtook him. He believed a teacher's duty ends only with death. One night, after dreaming of the ancient Zhou kings, Confucius awoke in tears. "The great mountain must crumble," he said. "The strong beam must break. The wise man must wither like a plant." He knew the end was near. He did not fear death. He feared unfinished work. A world still at war. Kings still cruel. People still suffering. He had planted seeds, but he would not live to see the forest. And yet, history was already moving. Students copied his words. Families taught his principles. Officials quoted his teachings. His ideas were spreading quietly, silently, irreversibly. Confucius had failed as a politician, but he had succeeded as something far greater. He had become the architect of a civilization. The final journey was approaching, and the world was not ready for what his death would unleash. Confucius died in the spring of 479 BC. There was no palace around his bed, no throne at his side, no army at his door, only students, only scrolls, only silence. The man who had spent his life walking between kingdoms now lay still. The teacher who had challenged kings could speak no more. For 3 days, his students did not move. They knelt beside him. They wept. They refused food. The man who had been their guide, their conscience, their compass through a collapsing world, was gone. Yan Hui was already dead. Zilu had fallen in battle. Many of his companions were gone. Now the master himself had followed them, and an entire generation felt orphaned. Confucius had once said, "If heaven intends that this culture be destroyed, those who come after me will not be able to take part in it. If heaven does not intend that this culture be destroyed, what can the men of today do to me?" Now heaven had taken him, and the question remained, would his culture survive? His funeral was simple. No royal procession, no monuments, no honors from the court. Just a group of students carrying their teacher to rest. But they mourned him as a king. They wore sackcloth for 3 years. They built huts beside his grave. They lived as he had taught, with discipline, with humility, with reverence. And then something remarkable happened. His death made him powerful. Kings who had ignored him now studied his words. Courts that had mocked him now sought his wisdom. Scholars who had dismissed him now copied his teachings. Because when a man dies for his principles, history listens. Confucius had failed to change his own age, but he had shaped the ages to come. Slowly, quietly, his ideas spread, from village schools to royal academies, from family homes to imperial courts, from wandering scholars to future emperors. His name became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of order, not of ambition, but of duty, not of power, but of virtue. The teacher had become an institution. The wanderer had become a foundation. The man who owned nothing had built a civilization. Centuries later, emperors would bow to his image. Schools would teach his words. Families would raise their children by his principles. A nation would shape itself around his philosophy. Confucius had not lived to see victory, but history had chosen him, and his legacy had only just begun. Confucius did not leave behind an army. He left behind a philosophy, and that philosophy would outlive every dynasty that followed. In the years after his death, China continued to burn. The warring states devoured each other. Cities fell, kingdoms vanished. The old order collapsed completely, and from the ruins, a new empire rose. The Qin dynasty, built by force, forged by terror, held together by fear. Books were burned. Scholars were buried alive. Ideas were treated as enemies. Confucianism was outlawed. The memory of Confucius was nearly erased. But ideas do not die easily. They wait. They endure. They survive in whispers, in families, in schools, in memory. And when the Qin Empire collapsed under its own cruelty, Confucius returned. The Han dynasty rose from the ashes, and its rulers understood something the Qin had not, that an empire cannot survive on force alone. It needs legitimacy. It needs moral authority. It needs a soul. The Han emperors turned to Confucius. They made his philosophy the foundation of government. His teachings became law, his ethics shaped policy, his vision defined civilization. Confucian scholars staffed the imperial bureaucracy. Education became the path to power. Merit replaced birth. Character replaced lineage. For the first time in history, the civilization was governed by philosophy. Examinations tested knowledge of Confucian texts. Officials were judged by moral conduct. Rulers were expected to lead by example. The empire was built not just on armies, but on ethics. For over 2,000 years, Confucius shaped China. Dynasty after dynasty rose and fell, but his ideas endured. They guided emperors. They shaped families. They molded society. From village schools to imperial courts, his words were law. Confucius became more than a philosopher. He became the architect of Chinese civilization, the moral spine of an empire, the conscience of a nation. His influence spread beyond China, to Korea, to Japan, to Vietnam. Across East Asia, societies were built around his principles. His vision became a civilization. The man who died as a wandering teacher had built an empire that spanned continents. History had chosen him, and humanity was still learning from him. Confucius is not a relic of the past. He is not a memory. He is not a statue gathering dust in a museum. He is alive, in classrooms, in families, in government halls, in the very fabric of East Asian society. More than 2,000 years after his death, his voice still shapes the lives of over 1 billion people. Walk into a Chinese school today. Children bow to their teachers. Students memorize his words. Discipline is treated as virtue. Education is seen as sacred duty. These are not modern inventions. They are Confucius. Walk into a family home. Respect for elders. Loyalty to parents. Duty before desire. Honor before pleasure. These are not traditions. They are Confucius. Walk into the halls of government. Merit-based examinations. Moral expectations of leaders. The belief that authority comes from character. These are not policies. They are Confucius. For 2,000 years, China did something no other civilization had ever done. It built itself around a philosopher, not a prophet, not a conqueror, not a king, but a teacher. Even when China modernized, even when revolutions swept away emperors, even when communism reshaped the nation, Confucius remained. He was criticized, attacked, banned, and then restored, because civilizations cannot survive without moral foundations. During the Cultural Revolution, Confucius was denounced. Temples were destroyed. Statues were smashed. His name was cursed. But when chaos followed, China returned to him, because power without morality destroys itself, just as Confucius had warned. Today, Confucius Institutes operate around the world. His teachings are studied in universities. His philosophy shapes diplomacy. His vision guides national identity. The man who once wandered homeless through war zones now speaks in every corner of the world, from Silicon Valley classrooms to African universities. to European philosophy halls. Confucius has outlived kings. He has outlived empires. He has outlived revolutions because ideas are stronger than armies, and wisdom is stronger than power. He once said, "Study the past if you would define the future." China did, and it built a civilization that endured. Confucius never ruled a kingdom, but he ruled the mind, and the mind shapes history. Confucius never conquered a city. He never commanded an army. He never wore a crown. He never built a palace. And yet, few men in history have shaped the world more deeply. He was born into chaos. He lived through war. He walked through famine. He challenged kings. He was betrayed by power. He died without victory. And still, he won because he did not fight for territory. He fought for civilization. Confucius believed that the world does not collapse because of evil men. It collapses because good men stop caring, because people abandon virtue for comfort, because rulers choose power over responsibility, because societies forget what it means to be human. He taught that greatness begins at home, that a nation is only as strong as its families, that leadership is service, that authority is earned, that discipline is freedom, that compassion is strength. He believed that the purpose of life was not success. It was character, not dominance, but dignity, not victory, but virtue. Confucius walked through a world ruled by fear and carried hope. He stood before tyrants and spoke of justice. He faced hunger with dignity. He faced exile with courage. He faced death with peace. He once said, "The superior man is distressed by his lack of ability, not by the failure of others to recognize him." He did not seek fame. He sought truth. He did not seek power. He sought harmony. And when the world rejected him, he did not turn bitter. He turned patient. He planted seeds, and he trusted time. 2,000 years later, his seeds became a civilization. His words became law. His teachings became tradition. His philosophy became culture. His dream became reality. Confucius proved something history often forgets, that ideas are stronger than swords, that teachers shape empires, that wisdom outlives kings, that character outlives power. He taught humanity that the highest form of leadership is moral leadership, that the strongest nation is not the one with the largest army, but the one with the most virtuous people, that the greatest victory is not conquering others, but conquering oneself. The barefoot philosopher who walked dusty roads built one of the longest lasting civilizations in history, not with force, but with principles, not with fear, but with discipline, not with conquest, but with conscience. Confucius never ruled a kingdom, but he ruled the idea of what a kingdom should be, and that changed the world. This is not the story of one man. This is the story of how civilization learned to govern itself, how power learned restraint, how humanity learned responsibility, how order was born from chaos. And as long as human beings ask, what is right? What is just? What is a good life? Confucius will still be walking beside them, because the man who taught China how to live taught the world how to think. Civilizations do not remember conquerors. They remember builders. They remember teachers. They remember those who shaped the soul of a people. Confucius lived in an age of swords, but he chose words. He lived in an age of war, but he chose wisdom. He lived in an age of power, but he chose principle. He walked through a broken world and refused to become broken. He saw cruelty and chose compassion. He saw corruption and chose righteousness. He saw chaos and chose order. He never ruled a kingdom, but he taught kings how to rule. He never commanded armies, but he taught generals discipline. He never built monuments, but he built minds. History is full of men who changed borders. Confucius changed behavior. History is full of men who reshaped maps. Confucius reshaped morality. History is full of men who built empires. Confucius built civilization. Long after the drums of war fell silent, long after dynasties rose and fell, long after palaces crumbled into dust, his words remained. In classrooms, in homes, in courts, in conscience, the world still struggles with power, still wrestles with greed, still stumbles through conflict, and still asks the same ancient questions. What is a good life? What makes a good leader? What holds a society together? Confucius answered them long ago, not with law, not with force, but with character. He believed that when individuals become virtuous, society heals. When families are strong, nation endure. When leaders are moral, civilizations flourish. He taught humanity that progress without ethics is dangerous, that intelligence without wisdom is destructive, that power without restraint is ruin. And he taught something more, that even in a world of chaos, a single life lived with integrity can change the course of history. Confucius walked through time so that future generations could walk with dignity. He did not build China. China built itself around him. And as long as human beings seek order in chaos, meaning in suffering, and wisdom in uncertainty, Confucius will still be teaching, because the greatest civilizations are not built with stone. They are built with values. Buy and have a good sleep.